While I'm talking about formations, I'll just say a little bit about scale in terms of figure scale here. The units you can see here, my models are 6mm. That's the scale I personally prefer to fight World War II in. I think it gives a better impression of the size of the battlefield and the range of the weapons. But Panzer Korps is equally happy with units at all sorts of scales. 15-20mm is probably the scale at which the rules were originally conceived, and all the measurements in the rules are given in inches for those two scales. For 6mm or lower indeed, they recommend that you use the same measurements but translated into centimetres, so 1 inch becomes 1 centimetre. If you want to fight with 28mm figures, then you can double the ranges as given in inches. Each of the companies, as I've mentioned before, is represented by a single base. In 15mm, 20mm, the recommendation is for 3 figures on a base, which will clearly be considerably larger than these bases here, which are an inch square, 25mm square. But the rules are not prescriptive. As I've mentioned before, the precise location orientation of these bases is not important anyway. What is important is the combined capability of the battalion, and you can move them around and shuffle them about anyway. So the rules do not specify, for example, how big a base needs to be, or indeed how many figures should be on it. As I said, personally I prefer the look of 6mm. I think they give slightly better impression of a much larger force. I mean, there are 6 or 7 figures on each of these bases, representing a company of, what, 100 or 100 plus men, as compared with 2 or 3 on a 15mm base. It's the other reason why I like to base my vehicles too, because that reminds me that that tank there is not a single tank. It represents an entire company of Churchills, or over there an entire company of armoured cars, occupying space, occupying an area of land represented by that square base. Now, the other thing I should say is that there is no necessity for the bases to be square. Again, there is no prescription within the rules, and in some cases, particularly for the attachments, I've used circular bases, small coins, to show the attachments going on with the company. But most of my 6mm figures are based on inch square metal bases. I've started that before I started using Panzer Korps, and as I said, the rules are not prescriptive for the base sizes and shapes, so whatever you've got will almost certainly do fine. As an aside, while we're talking about scale, I mentioned when I was discussing the 6mm figures how they gave for me a better impression of a large group of men occupying space as a company or a battalion, and the obvious logical progression is to go down another level, and here we have in front of us 3mm figures from Oddziol, the Polish company. This represents an Italian Bersaglieri battalion. 3 companies in the front there, and with some attachments, a couple of light tank M1340s and a 47mm anti-tank gun company attached. And yes, indeed, they do give, in my opinion, again, a better impression. You've got a dozen figures on each of those company bases. Again, still far short of the actual number, but you are definitely getting a better impression of a substantial group of men, rather than 2 or 3 figures on a 15mm base. 2 reasons why I've not gone the whole hog and built all my armies on this. Firstly, I have a vast amount of time and money, but mostly time, invested in literally thousands of figures at the 6mm level. The other problem is I find the infantry figures from this company rather difficult to work with. The metal is very hard, and trying to break them off the sprue without losing most of them at the knee is something I've always struggled with. But the real issue is, I think, just changing. If I was starting from scratch, I might well begin by building from 3mm level, and it certainly does give the impression of a large-scale battle seen from a very high level.